The peaceful planet of Epsilon 5 was home to the Gathar, a species that had long abandoned the art of war. They had achieved great technological advancements, built towering cities, and spread their influence across the stars. They lived in peace, focusing on knowledge, exploration, and improving their way of life. However, over generations, their once mighty warriors had faded into history, and with it, their strength. No longer were they a race of fighters. Now they were a people of diplomats, thinkers, and scientists. But in a galaxy full of dangers, this peace came with a cost. The Gathar had never faced true war. Their neighboring civilizations were more aggressive, more militarized, and constantly seeking new territories to conquer. The Gathar knew their lack of warriors was a weakness, and that weakness was becoming more and more apparent. The day came when a shadow fell upon their peaceful existence. A message arrived from one of their distant allies, a friendly species from the planet Tyros, warning of a large military force assembling near the edge of their space. It was a force that had destroyed other peaceful planets like theirs, and it was moving closer. The Gathar Council convened in a large, circular room, the walls of which were lined with holographic displays and ancient scrolls. Their leaders, wise and thoughtful, gathered around the table. Their faces were serious, but none of them knew what to do. They had no army. They had no warriors. What could they do against an invading force that was far superior in strength? They had never needed to build an army, relying instead on diplomacy and their technological advancements to keep peace. But now, it seemed, that strategy was failing them. "I fear our time of peace has come to an end," said Talier, the head of the Gathar Council. His voice was filled with concern. "We cannot wait for this enemy to arrive at our doorstep. If they come, we will not be able to stop them. Our cities, our way of life, will be destroyed." The room fell silent. The council members exchanged uneasy glances. None of them had the answer, but they all knew one thing: the Gathar could not fight this war alone. They needed help, and they needed it quickly. "We must ask for aid," said Lyra, the youngest council member. Her voice trembled slightly, but there was determination in her eyes. "We must send a signal, a cry for help to the stars. Perhaps there are others who can help us." A murmur of agreement spread through the room. But who could they turn to? Their usual allies were small and weak, much like themselves. There was no one who could match the might of the approaching force. Then, a thought struck Talier. There were stories, old stories that had been told for centuries, about the Deathworlders, a mysterious and brutal race of warriors who were feared throughout the galaxy. Legends said they came from worlds where survival was a daily struggle. Their people lived on harsh planets, fighting for every breath of air and every morsel of food. The Deathworlders were warriors, and they were known for their strength, their ferocity, and their willingness to fight. "Perhaps we should send a message to them," Talier said slowly, the idea taking root. "The Deathworlders are out there. They are brutal, but they are warriors. If anyone can help us, it is them." The council members were hesitant. They had heard the stories too, but none of them had ever encountered the Deathworlders firsthand. These beings were known for their ruthless ways. They had no place in the peaceful world of the Gathar. But time was running out, and they had no choice. "We must do it," Lyra said. "We have no other choice." And so the decision was made. The Gathar would send a message to the Deathworlders, pleading for help. They would send a cry across the stars, hoping that someone, anyone, would hear it. The message would be simple: "We are in need. Help us, or we will fall." The Gathar's engineers worked quickly to prepare the message. Using their most advanced technology, they encoded the cry in a signal that could travel across light years. The signal would carry the message of desperation, reaching out into the vast unknown of space. It was a gamble, a long shot, but it was all they had. As the signal was launched, the council members stood in silence, watching the display as it flickered and vanished into the stars. "We have done all we can," Talier said softly. "Now we wait." The Gathar did not know how long they would wait. The stars were vast, and the Deathworlders were far away. But they held on to hope, even if it was a fragile hope. They had sent their cry across the stars, and now all they could do was wait for a response. Meanwhile, light years away, in the depths of space, the signal reached the ears of the Deathworlders. The message traveled through the void, carried by the vastness of space, until it reached a small outpost on a harsh, desolate planet known as Pirac 6. This planet, home to one of the most feared and battle-hardened species in the galaxy, was a place where only the strong survived. The outpost was a simple structure, built to withstand the harsh environment of Pirac 6. The air was thick with dust, and the sky was perpetually dark, filled with swirling clouds of ash. The inhabitants of the planet were not interested in peace or diplomacy. They were soldiers, mercenaries, and survivors of the most brutal of worlds. At the center of the outpost, a large communication station hummed with activity. A single monitor flickered to life, displaying the message from Epsilon 5. The signal was weak, but it was clear enough. The Deathworlders had heard the cry. A figure standing in front of the monitor studied the message. This was Captain Corin, the leader of the Deathworlders stationed at the Pirac 6 outpost. He was tall, with scars crisscrossing his face and a hardened expression that spoke of a lifetime spent in battle. His armor was battered from years of use, but it was still functional. Corin's eyes narrowed as he read the message. "A cry for help," he muttered under his breath. "From the Gathar, weak, peaceful fools, but they know enough to ask for help. Let's see what they want." Corin turned to his subordinates, his voice cold and commanding. "Prepare the fleet. We are going to answer their call." The Deathworlders did not hesitate. They were known for their speed, their ruthless efficiency, and their willingness to do whatever it took to win. Within hours, a fleet of warships was mobilized, prepared to make the long journey to Epsilon 5. Corin knew the Gathar were weak, but there was something about the challenge that excited him. The Gathar would be their prey, and the Deathworlders would be their hunters. As the fleet prepared for departure, Corin stood at the command center, staring at the screen. He knew this would be no easy task. The Gathar might be peaceful, but they were not completely defenseless. And whatever threat awaited them, the Deathworlders would face it head-on, with no hesitation, no mercy. The stars stretched out before them, and as the ships powered up and began their journey, Corin could feel the tension building. They were going to answer the cry, and the Gathar would soon know the true meaning of survival. The Deathworlders were coming. The journey across the stars was long and filled with uncertainty. The Deathworlders' fleet cut through the vast emptiness of space at incredible speeds. The ships, each one a testament to the harsh worlds from which they came, hummed with power. They were vessels designed for combat, built to withstand the most brutal conditions. The crew aboard these ships were seasoned warriors, hardened by years of survival in environments where only the strongest survived. They had all fought in countless battles, and now they were headed to answer a call from a distant, peaceful planet. Captain Corin stood at the command center of the lead ship, his eyes fixed on the view outside the thick, reinforced windows. The stars stretched endlessly before them, and in the distance, the small blue and green orb of Epsilon 5 was slowly coming into view. A faint signal had been sent across the stars, and now the Deathworlders were on their way to answer it. "Prepare for entry into the Epsilon system," Corin ordered, his voice calm yet commanding. The crew sprang into action, making final adjustments to the ship systems. The tension in the air was palpable. No one knew exactly what to expect when they arrived on Epsilon 5. The Gathar, the species that inhabited the planet, were peaceful and technologically advanced, but they had no military force to defend themselves. That was why the Deathworlders had been called. The only problem was, no one was quite sure what kind of help the Gathar wanted. Corin had his own suspicions. From the message they had received, it seemed the Gathar were facing a threat from an unknown enemy. They were a race that had grown complacent in their peaceful existence, relying on diplomacy and technology to protect them. But now, their world was under threat, and they had nowhere to turn. The Deathworlders, on the other hand, were not afraid of war. They thrived on it. Their worlds had shaped them into merciless warriors, and now they would use their skills to protect the Gathar, whether the Gathar wanted it or not. As the fleet moved closer to the planet, Corin began to consider what would happen when they arrived. Would the Gathar welcome them as saviors, or would they reject them out of fear of the Deathworlders' brutal ways? Corin was no stranger to rejection. The Deathworlders were not liked in many parts of the galaxy. Their reputation for ruthlessness preceded them. But Corin didn't care about that. They were warriors, and they had a job to do. The Gathar had sent a call for help, and the Deathworlders had answered. It was as simple as that. The fleet entered the Epsilon system, and the large blue planet grew larger in the viewports. Corin's ship was the first to break through the atmosphere, descending toward the Gathar homeworld. The planet below was lush and beautiful, with sprawling cities and vast oceans. It was everything the Deathworlders' worlds were not, peaceful, calm, and free of violence. The contrast between the two races could not have been starker. As the ships landed, Corrin gave the order for his team to disembark. He led the way, stepping onto the soft grass of Epsilon 5's surface. The air was fresh, the sky clear and bright. The Gathar, a peaceful race of humanoid beings, were waiting for them. They stood in a long line, watching the Deathworlders approach with a mix of awe and fear. Talir, the leader of the Gathar, stepped forward to greet Corrin. He was tall and thin, his features sharp and delicate. He wore a simple robe that reflected the Gathar's peaceful way of life. There was no armor, no weapons, just a man of peace standing before a group of warriors who had come to save his people. "Welcome to Epsilon 5, Talir said, his voice warm but cautious. "We are grateful for your response to our plea for help." Corrin regarded him for a moment before speaking. "We have come to help, but know this, we do not offer our protection freely. If we are to fight your enemy, we will do so on our terms." Talir looked uncomfortable at Corrin's words, but he nodded. "We understand. We have no choice but to accept your aid. Our enemies are coming. They will destroy us if we do not act quickly." The Gathar leaders had known this moment would come, but they had hoped it would never happen. They had hoped their peaceful ways would be enough to protect them, but they had been wrong. Now, they had to face the reality that they needed the Deathworlders' strength to survive. But there was one thing they didn't know, the cost of this survival. "Tell me about your enemy," Corrin said, his voice cold and calculating. "What are we up against?" Talir's expression grew darker. "We do not know much. They are a hostile species from a distant system. They are known as the Varnock, a ruthless and aggressive race. They have attacked several neighboring planets, and now they are heading toward Epsilon 5. They have advanced weapons and fleets, and we have no means of defending ourselves." Corrin's eyes narrowed. "Sounds like they've made a mistake." The Gathar were silent, watching the Deathworlders with a mixture of fear and curiosity. They had never seen warriors like these before. The Deathworlders were a different breed, their strength and brutality unmatched by anything the Gathar had ever known. Corrin and his warriors exuded an aura of power, their mere presence enough to make the Gathar uneasy. But Talir knew there was no other choice. They needed the Deathworlders. "How soon will they arrive?" Corrin asked. "They should be here within a few days," Talir replied. "We have no time to waste." "Then we'll waste no time," Corrin said. "Prepare your people, we are going to train them." Talir's eyes widened. "Train them, but we are not warriors. We have no need for weapons. We are a peaceful people." Corrin's lips curled into a grim smile. "You have need for warriors now, and you will learn quickly. The Varnock do not care for peace. They care only for power. If you want to survive, you will fight." The Gathar were hesitant, but there was no time for hesitation. They had no other choice but to accept the Deathworlders' way of doing things. The training began immediately. The Gathar, who had never held a weapon in their hands, were taught how to fight, how to defend themselves. Corrin's warriors showed them the basics, how to wield a blade, how to use a blaster, how to move in combat. It was harsh, brutal, and not at all what the Gathar had ever imagined their peaceful world would become. The training was grueling. The Gathar struggled, their peaceful nature conflicting with the brutal tactics they were being taught, but they had no choice. If they wanted to survive, they had to become something they had never been before, warriors. Corrin watched them with a critical eye. He knew they would never be as strong as the Deathworlders, but they didn't need to be. They just needed to learn how to fight and hold their ground long enough to survive. The Varnock were coming, and the Gathar had to be ready. As the days passed, the Gathar grew stronger. They learned to fight with a fierceness they had never known. But it was clear to Corrin that they would need more than just training. They needed real combat experience. "You are ready," Corrin said one evening as the last of the training exercises came to an end. "But we don't have time for practice anymore. The Varnock are on their way. Tomorrow we fight." The Gathar were quiet, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. They had never wanted this. They had never wanted to fight, but now they had no choice. They would stand with the Deathworlders or they would fall. As the sun set over the peaceful world of Epsilon 5, the Gathar prepared for the battle that was about to come. It would be the fight of their lives, and for some, it would be the last fight they would ever have. The Deathworlders had come to help, but the cost of that help was far greater than the Gathar had ever imagined. The days that followed were filled with tension. The Gathar had trained hard, but no amount of preparation could fully prepare them for the reality of war. The Deathworlders, on the other hand, were ready. They had seen battle after battle, fought on the harshest planets, and survived against all odds. Now they were ready to defend Epsilon 5, no matter the cost. Captain Corrin stood at the front of the Deathworlders' makeshift command center. It was a small, hardened structure on the outskirts of one of the Gathar cities. The walls were lined with maps of the planet, holographic displays of the approaching enemy fleet, and strategic diagrams of the terrain. Corrin paced back and forth, his mind working quickly. He could feel the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The Gathar were counting on them. The Gathar didn't fully understand what war meant, and it was up to him and his warriors to ensure their survival. "How long until the Varnock arrive?" Corrin asked, his voice steady but edged with impatience. "Less than 24 hours, one of his officers replied. "Their fleet is already in the outer rim of the system. We can't afford to waste any more time." Corrin nodded. "Then it's time." He turned to face the Gathar leaders who had gathered in the command center. They stood in silence, their faces filled with anxiety and uncertainty. Talir, the leader of the Gathar, stepped forward. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by the exhaustion of too many sleepless nights. He had seen the change in his people. They had gone from peaceful scholars to reluctant warriors, but even now, as the battle loomed close, he wasn't sure if they were truly ready. "We've trained them as best as we could," Talir said, his voice thick with doubt. "But they are not warriors, Corrin." "They've never fought before." Corrin met Talir's gaze. "I know," he said calmly, "but they will fight because they have to. This isn't a choice anymore, it's survival." Talir nodded, though he still looked uncertain. The Gathar had done everything they could to prepare, but they were not a race of fighters. Their natural inclination was toward peace, not combat. Corrin understood this, and that was why he had pushed them so hard. He knew they would never be as ruthless or experienced as the Deathworlders, but they had something that no one could take away from them: the will to survive. The night before the battle, the Gathar warriors gathered in their camp. They wore the makeshift armor they had been given, their faces grim as they prepared for the upcoming fight. Corrin walked among them, his presence commanding respect. He could see the fear in their eyes, the doubt in their movements. But there was something else too, a glimmer of resolve. They had no choice but to fight, and that made them dangerous. As the first rays of the sun rose over the planet, the Deathworlder fleet moved into position. The Gathar forces were positioned along key defensive points, ready to protect the cities from the impending attack. Corrin stood at the front of his forces, overlooking the battlefield. His warriors were already in position, ready to unleash the full fury of their training. The Gathar were spread out in smaller groups, with the Deathworlders at their sides to guide them through the chaos that was about to unfold. The Varnock arrived just as the sun reached its peak. Their ships entered the system in a thunderous display of power, their massive warships filling the skies. The Varnock were a brutal, merciless race, known for their aggressive tactics and thirst for conquest. They had no interest in diplomacy or negotiations. They came to take what they wanted, and if they had to destroy everything in their path to do so, they would. Their ships unleashed a barrage of fire, striking the Gathar defenses with terrifying force. The battle had begun. Corrin's voice rang out over the comms, giving his warriors their orders. "Hold the line! Do not let them pass!" The Deathworlders moved with deadly precision. They took cover behind the fortified walls, using their weapons to pick off any Varnock forces that got too close. The Gathar were not used to this kind of fighting, but Corrin had trained them well. They held their ground, following the Deathworlders' lead as best as they could. They fired their weapons, but it was clear that they were still struggling. The Deathworlders, however, fought like a well-oiled machine. They moved as one, covering each other's backs, using their experience to turn the tide of battle in their favor. The Varnock pushed forward relentlessly, but the Deathworlders were relentless in turn. Corrin led from the front, his presence inspiring the Gathar to fight harder to hold the line. The battle raged on for hours, the air filled with the sound of blasters firing, explosions shaking the ground, and the cries of the wounded. It was a brutal, chaotic scene. The Gathar fought side by side with the Deathworlders, learning quickly what it meant to survive in a world ruled by war. As the hours passed, the Gathar grew more confident. They may not have been warriors by nature, but they were learning. And as they fought, they discovered something within themselves, a deep, primal instinct that had been dormant for so long. It was the instinct to protect, to survive. They fought for their families, their homes, and their future, and with every passing moment they grew stronger. By the time the Varnock forces were finally driven back, the landscape of Epsilon 5 had changed forever. The battlefield was littered with the remains of destroyed warships, the ground scarred by explosions, and the air thick with smoke. The Gathar had fought with everything they had, and it had been enough. The Deathworlders had shown them how to fight, but it was the Gathar's will to survive that had ultimately won the day. Corrin surveyed the battlefield, his eyes scanning the carnage. The Varnock were retreating, their forces broken and scattered. It had been a hard-fought victory, but a victory nonetheless. He turned to Talir, who was standing nearby, his face streaked with dirt and blood. The once peaceful leader of the Gathar looked different now. He was no longer just a diplomat, he was a survivor. "You did well," Corrin said, his voice rough from the battle. "Your people fought well." Talir nodded, his expression grim. "We had no choice." "No," Corrin agreed, "but you did what needed to be done." The battle had been won, but it had come at a cost. The Gathar had lost many of their own in the fight, and the scars of the battle would remain on their planet for years to come. But they had survived, and they had learned. They had learned the price of survival in a galaxy that knew no mercy. As the Deathworlders prepared to leave Epsilon 5, their work here was done. The Gathar were no longer the peaceful, defenseless race they had once been. They had been forged in the fires of war, and though they would never fully embrace the brutal ways of the Deathworlders, they had learned the most important lesson of all: survival. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The battle was over, but the world of Epsilon 5 would never be the same again. The Varnock had been pushed back, their invasion halted, but the cost of survival was high. The ground was littered with the remnants of war, burned-out husks of warships, scorched earth, and the bodies of fallen soldiers. The Gathar had fought bravely, but they had lost many. And though the Deathworlders had proven their strength, they knew that victory wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a new chapter for the Gathar. Captain Corrin stood at the edge of the battlefield, his eyes scanning the horizon. The smoke had begun to clear, but the scent of burnt metal and ozone still lingered in the air. His warriors had fought with the ferocity of the Deathworlders, but there was no denying that the Gathar had paid a heavy price. They had learned the hard truth of survival. Peace, in a galaxy so full of war, was a fragile illusion. Talir approached, his face tired and drawn. The once hopeful leader of the Gathar now seemed to carry the weight of the planet's future on his shoulders. His robes were torn and his hands were stained with the blood of his people. He looked at Corrin, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "You were right," Talir said, his voice low. "This is not the peace we thought we had. We've learned that lesson the hard way." Corrin nodded. "You've done well, you've protected your people, you've learned to fight, and that's what matters." Talir shook his head. "But at what cost? So many have died, so many of our people who never wanted this. We have changed, Corrin. And I'm not sure if we can ever go back to what we were." Corrin's eyes softened. "You may never be what you once were, but you've become something stronger. The Gathar are no longer weak. You've learned to fight for what's yours. You've learned to survive." Talir looked down at his hands, still trembling from the battle. He had never imagined this for his people. But now, as he stood amidst the destruction, he understood that survival meant sacrifice. He had seen his people rise to the challenge, but he also knew that the price of that survival would haunt them forever. "Will we ever be able to rebuild?" Talir asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Corrin considered the question carefully before answering. "It will take time, but yes, you will rebuild. You will learn from this. The Deathworlders came to answer your call, but it is you who will carry the future of Epsilon 5. You've become stronger than you think." Talir looked at the ruins of his world, his heart heavy. The Gathar had lost much in the battle, but they had gained something in return, a newfound strength. They had learned the ways of war, but at what cost? They would never be the same, and neither would the world they had once known. As the Deathworlder fleet prepared to leave Epsilon 5, the Gathar watched from the surface, their gazes filled with mixed emotions. The warriors who had come to their aid now turned to leave, their mission complete. The Gathar had survived, but they had paid the price. And now the Deathworlders would be gone, their brutal help no longer needed. Corrin stood at the edge of the fleet, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His people, the Deathworlders, were survivors by nature. They were used to the harsh realities of war, but they did not linger after a fight. Their business was done. The Gathar had learned the hard way, and now it was time for the Deathworlders to move on. But as he looked at the faces of the Gathar, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. They had done what was necessary. They had fought, and they had won. The Gathar approached Corin as the fleet prepared to depart. Talir stepped forward, his face solemn but determined. He extended a hand to Corin, a gesture of respect. Corin met his gaze, then took his hand firmly. "Thank you," Talir said simply, "for everything." Corin nodded. "You've earned your survival, now it's up to you to carry on." With that, the Deathworlders turned and boarded their ships, ready to depart. The fleet slowly lifted off, their engines roaring as they ascended into the sky. The Gathar watched as the ships disappeared into the stars, knowing that they would never forget the lesson they had learned. As the fleet vanished from sight, Talir turned to the remaining Gathar warriors. The battle was over, but the work was far from done. The Gathar would rebuild, but they would do so with the scars of war forever etched into their hearts. "We've won today," Talir said, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "But the real challenge begins now. We must rebuild our world, our people. We must ensure that we never forget what we've learned." The Gathar nodded in agreement. The death and destruction of the battle had shaken them to their core, but they knew that they had emerged stronger. They would never again be the peaceful, weak species they had once been. They would rebuild their cities, their families, and their lives. But they would also carry the lessons of war with them, knowing that survival in this galaxy came at a cost. The Gathar had been changed forever. But now they were ready to face the future with the strength and determination that they had once lacked. They would rebuild, and they would fight for their survival, no matter what challenges the galaxy threw their way. As the sun set over the battlefield, Talir stood with his people, watching the horizon. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The Gathar would never again be the same. They had learned to survive, and that was something no one could take away from them. The galaxy was a harsh place, and only the strong survived. The Gathar had learned that lesson well, and now they would face whatever came next with the same resolve that had carried them through the darkest days of their history.